now. Oh shit.
Tokyo Revengers follows Takemichi Hanagaki, a 26-year-old part-timer who's hit rock bottom in life. One day, he learns from the news that his only girlfriend from middle school, Hinata Tachibana, and her younger brother Naoto have been killed by the Tokyo Manji Gang, a violent group that has taken control of the underworld. Shortly after this discovery, Takemichi is pushed in front of a train, but instead of dying, he finds himself sent 12 years into the past, back in his middle school days. Realizing he has a second chance, Takemichi decides to change the course of the future and save Hinata. Through trial and error, Takemichi learns that he can time travel by shaking hands with Naoto Tachibana, who survives in the original timeline after Takemichi warns him in the past. With this ability, he dives deep into the dangerous world of youth delinquent gangs, particularly the Tokyo Manji gang, Toman, whose internal conflicts and violent shifts are the root cause of Hinata's death.
Okay, with the plot synopsis out of the way, thank you very much. I want to jump into this by starting with a little historical background about what the show, where the show is coming from, and the kind of like cultural history there, because I think it's really interesting and it says a lot about shows like this, shows like weirdly a lot of O-grade properties like Air Gear, Tenjo Tenge also touch on some stuff that is mixed in with this. Yu Hakusho shares more than a few qualities with Tokyo Revengers, and what that is really involves something that's probably best laid out in um not GTO, not Great Teacher Onizuka, but I think it's called like Young GTO or something. It came out. The original GTO, Great Teacher Onizuka, came out in the late '90s, early aughts, and the Young GTO thing came out much later. I think maybe 2014 esque. I could be totally wrong on that, but the thing that GTO is coming from the original Great Teacher Onizuka is you are seeing a grown up version of the kinds of gang who was a grown up version of somebody who was involved with the kinds of gangs that are highlighted in Tokyo Revengers, and that specifically is subculture of delinquents and gangs called Bosozoku gangs. And there's a female equivalent of this, of course, called Sukeban. And the Sukeban have been more recently covered, but both of them are few and far between right now. And as a matter of fact, the kind of pipeline effect that you see in the time traveling of Tokyo Revengers is a real thing, but it's much less. These gangs grow up and become their own, in their own right, Yakuza gangs. They actually, it's much more of a, this person wants to graduate to a different kind of crooked life, and so they get taken in by a Yakuza family, that kind of thing. A lot of like membership flows up from these smaller gangs to like Yakuza, more organized crime situations. At least it used to. That has changed a lot since even this show first came out. Since it's changed a lot since the 90s, mostly thanks to a lot of organized crime laws. But the thing I really want to talk about was Bosozoku gangs, and the thing that I think is highlighted really well in Tokyo Revengers specifically is this idea of what do you do with the misfits? What do you do with the people who don't quite fit in? Because the very beginning of Tokyo Revengers, you encounter when Takemichi first gets thrown back into the past, you encounter these kinds of wannabe, this like vast range of wannabe delinquents and then the real deal. And probably the best character we can focus on from wannabe to say a wannabe delinquent and the real deal, even though Takemichi eventually grows into being a like meaningful member of Tomon, the Tokyo Majin gang, the young Bosozoku gang that we follow in Tokyo Revengers, is the number 2 in Tomon, a character named Draken. And when I say wannabe versus the real deal, very many of the characters that you're seeing in, especially in the first parts of the Tokyo Revengers story, are these, punk kids with an attitude. And that will get you relatively far, but there's a kind of conditioning that happens when you're really from the streets in the way that Draken is, when you're really like in a world that is in between, that is like clearly down the crack of the sidewalk and not a mainstream thing. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that Draken's mom is a sex worker, and she's still a sex worker, and she had him freakishly young, and his home life is living in a brothel. And spoilers for all of Tokyo Revengers, by the way, if you haven't picked up on that by now. But the difference between him and a lot of the other, including in the beginning and kind of even all the way through Takemichi, difference between someone like Draken or even Mikey, or really a lot of the like main cast of the Tokyo Majin gang, is that they were always on the outside. And there's this, and it's been true for a really long time. It's probably one of the best places you can see it in anime is in the JoJo fandom. There's this romanticizing of the lifestyle of Bosozoku gangs and of Sukeban gangs with young people that was eventually co-opted by, bigger industry to like sell young people on stuff. But what ends up happening is that romanticism and that want to imitate the gangs, the like young biker gangs, causes, you know, punk kids who have no real muscle behind their, you know, existence to want to play the part and increasingly get themselves in more trouble, and especially in this show, because they are tangling with not just the like top of the pyramid, in this case somebody like Draken or any of the other characters from Tomon at the beginning, but in fact other posers, people who are like a farther along in their like journey of assuming the kind of delinquent Bosozoku aesthetic, and in some cases an attempt at that like life. But in the case of someone like Takemichi, he's playing at that, but he's not quite there. And the thing with Takemichi is you get, and Takemichi and his friends like Akun eventually, is you get a little bit of their internalities. So you see like, oh, this kid barely knows what he's doing. Like he's just kind of hoping that it goes well on some level. But in the case of a character, the case of like the bully characters, I forget their names, but the bully delinquent characters at the very beginning of the show, you don't get that external, you don't get that internal monologue or internal view with them. But when push comes to shove, they can't stand with the real thing. And the real thing recognizes, like, it recognizes a want to actually be that kind of person, not just the want to attain power for power's sake. Because to Draken or Mikey, the life they're living is kind of what they have. It's not always so clear a choice. I mean, Draken has a tattoo on the side of his head. Very many of the characters in these, who are like real big deal, like like Bosozoku, or even later on in the show, gangster characters, have all the trappings of this stuff, such that they've gone so far down the road that this is definitely what their deal is. A character named Hanma has tattoos of like, I think it's like crime and punishment or something on the backs of his hands. And the big history of tattooing everywhere, but particularly in Japan, tattoos were given to prisoners to mark them in case they escaped, so they really had no way out of being somebody who had been condemned somehow. And the practice of the really ornate tattoos that you see on members of the Yakuza in Japan was actually originally a cover-up practice, because they used to put the tattoo somewhere on your body. So what members of the Yakuza would do is they would get these innate, beautiful Japanese, now known as Japanese tattoos, to cover essentially like an X or a mark that like a jailer or whoever apprehended them would put on them to mark them as, this is a bad person, don't give this person a job, don't give them opportunities. And oftentimes that apprehension process, as with any kind of police apprehension anywhere at any time, is not fair. There's a great video from I forget the name of it's called something Earth, but I'll put a link to it in the description of the podcast and the YouTube video. But it's this exploration of Japan's underclass, of Japan's untouchable class, essentially. I think what they call them in the video, and the actual technical term for them, is the Barakamon class. And these are people who are kind of no fault of their own very often, outsiders to Japanese society in some way. Lots of times this is people are disabled, people who are, half in such a way that's not agreeable. Oftentimes anybody who's not pure blood Japanese. And what people realize on some level, but don't realize on a lot of levels, is those people still have to live a life. And very often with the children of those people who inherit the kind of unfair sins cast upon their parents, they don't get a choice, or the choice becomes a much harder thing to enforce when you make a choice. As say, if you would say Draken, if you wanted to work your way out of the scenario of being born of a sex worker and living in a brothel and having that kind of uncouth, unclean, quote unquote, life, that's a lot harder than if you were just born to a middle class family in a suburb of Tokyo and you wanted to go in the opposite direction, like Takemichi, for example. If you wanted to go in the reverse direction, it's easier to go down into the depths than to come up out of it, especially when you're starting at that low point. And so much of the media surrounding Bosozoku gangs and delinquents and all of that stuff, eventually the good stuff comes to reckon with the fact that these kids are doing this because they don't necessarily feel like they have a choice, but the end state is not something that anybody would really want for them or anyone else. A perfect example from Yu Hakusho. Huge spoilers for Yu Hakusho if you haven't finished it. At the very end of Yu Hakusho, after the Dark Tournament and the Demon Tournament and all the bad filler that's at the very end of that thing, there's a time skip. And you come to, and I think they did I'm pretty sure they did a OVA where they actually did this part of the show as an OVA many, many years after the original Yu Yu Hakusho had ended, as a kind of anniversary piece. But the time skip shows that eventually what Yusuke was doing wasn't a thing that was above board or was easily translated to a professional environment in modern day Tokyo in the 90s when he would have been, becoming an adult. And there's a really clever thing that you don't realize that they're doing the entire time in Yu Yu Hakusho, where they're focusing almost in a dual way on Yusuke and Keiko, his love interest and his girlfriend, really, the entire time. And what the show, and Togashi in particular, this is a very particular choice he makes, hit you over the head with at the end of that show is that, Yusuke is this, incredible, demon-slaying, spirit world badass, but that doesn't mean that he gets a great life in the real world. That doesn't mean that he's not still a, delinquent child who basically didn't go to school, of a single alcoholic mother who doesn't live in a great part of town. His shonen action hero-ness does not exclude him from the realities of the real world. And that's a really interesting part of that show, because what it's saying is Yusuke is shown to be really smart in the show. Yusuke is shown to be really practical, and he's a good person, but he's not necessarily always a kind person. But he's real in a way that is, important and valuable, and he has all the traits of like a classical shonen action hero with a lot more attitude to show for it, really. And it doesn't amount to anything. The society still doesn't have a place for him. So he ends up running a ramen stand, and there's this like sad moment in the conclusion of that story where Keiko is like coming to his ramen stand at least once a week and checking up on him, and like she knows that he is this great big powerful badass, but it doesn't matter. He still didn't go anywhere because the world he is in does not have a blueprint for what to do with him. And that, in fact, is what happens to kind of a lot of people in any country, in any culture, is there's no way for people to really understand what to do with you, then it can be really difficult. You have to kind of carve your own space. And that's easier to do in a place like, say, America, where individuality is prized and doing your own thing is a mark of, like, American ingenuity and all that stuff. But what does it look like to have to do that in a country and a culture where collectivism and being a part of a whole is way more valued, where like a communal mindset is there? Well, oftentimes what that looks like is if you're not accepted by the community as it exists, you try and build your own. And a lot of what the kind of like admiration for that rebel spirit of Bosozoku gangs or even Yakuza gangs. There are Yakuza fanzines in Japan. I can't imagine there's as many as there used to be, but there used to be a lot. Admire is that like these are people that made their own thing on some level. It took their lives into their own hands. And yes, there's criminality there, but there's also a sense of like being deeply accepting of difference and of otherness in a way that is not common in a more collectivist mold, or even a more individualist mold like America. If you stop and think about it, there are tons of people who just don't, where America, as individualist as we are, which is increasingly a problem, there's a certain bar that if you don't meet, people aren't really interested in helping. And what that leads to is people needing to find their own spaces or carve out their own spaces. And for characters like Draken, for characters like Mikey, that came in the form of like meeting each other pretty early on, and then meeting a whole bunch of other fuck-ups and making a place, and all of them making a place for themselves, making a organization where they could belong to, and where they mattered and they counted and they were accepted. And as Takemichi gets further and further involved with Toman, he sees this pretty clearly. He sees that like they have all the same interpersonal relationships and issues that everyone else does, but they just weren't built to the same specifications as every other kid was, so they needed to make their own thing. And this is something that you see a lot in most things that deal with the Yakuza as well. One of my favorite books of all times is this book called Tokyo Vice. It got an HBO show that's pretty good, but not really the same thing as the book. But it's based on years of reporting by Jake Adelstein, and like covers a very particular beat he was on at the very end of his career when he switched from being a reporter to a writer and like private investigator kind of deal. And what he says very specifically, I think it's in, might not even be in Tokyo Vice, it might be in Tokyo Noir, the follow-up book to that came out much more recently, is that the Yakuza have much less trepidation about things like queerness, things like all kinds of otherness than many other people, because they can't afford to worry about that. And oftentimes them being parts of, alternative lifestyle groups, whether it be a non-Japanese ethnicity, like being half Korean or completely Korean, or some other thing that would put them in that Baraka Man mold, is what got them involved with as a Yakuza member in the first place. You don't decide. It's well, you can, but it's not as common as people would think to just decide to be a member of an organized crime family. Very often, if you have better options, you end up pursuing those. And in the Tokyo Vice show, one of the main characters has a younger brother who starts to get pulled in by more nefarious members of his Yakuza family, and he goes to the younger brother and he's like, "You can't be doing this. I did this because I didn't have a choice, because I didn't feel like I had a choice. You do. You're a smart kid. Don't do this. Don't fuck with this shit. If I find you again, I'm telling Mom, and she won't let you out of her sight." And it's very clear that, Sato is the name of the character there, did feel like he didn't have a choice. And you see that he's certainly not the youngest, like, Yakuza soldier, but he's at this, like, very particular middle point in his, career as a member of an organized crime family, that he is just about to, like, hit the next rung on the ladder. I think even by the end of the show, he ends up being the boss of his family. But he has a clarity that's like, you shouldn't want to do this. And when it comes to his family members, he's like, this is not going to be what you do. This is going to be what I do, because this is what I do now. This is the path I ended up taking, but I didn't really have a choice. You do. And for so many of these characters, including Takemichi, because of the trappings of the story, they don't have a choice but to be in a thing like Toman, or be even a particularly dangerous delinquent, because society is not prepared to make room for them, or to allow for, like, a soft landing for them, in a way that's fundamentally unfair. The characters you meet in Tokyo Revengers are experiencing a kind of fundamental imbalance that isn't really right, because it's not really, all things are not equal in the case of this show, because they don't have, no one feels like they have an option. It feels like this is what they're doing. And the show, I think Tokyo Revengers captured this really incredibly, because it's a time travel story, and the point of the time travel story is to try and keep Takemichi's at one point girlfriend, at one point ex-girlfriend, but later on the show, you realize that like Hinata Tachibana, his only ever girlfriend, never really fell out of love with him. Like, never really recovered from that breakup, and she wants that relationship back. But the thing that Takemichi and her brother Naoto is trying to are trying to stop is her death. Also Naoto's death, but her death. And as point of fact, by doing that, Takemichi is also rehabilitating his own life, because he was this wannabe punk who was so focused on being that, but once again didn't have, quite frankly, the spine or the confidence to fake it till you make it at that he ended up, and they show you this really early in the show, he ended up failing out of the traditional role too. So by trying to chase one thing instead of the traditional role that he could have just studied, did okay in school, gotten to a halfway decent thing, and like been part of the working class of Japan. But because he didn't focus on that and didn't really commit hard enough to the alternate path that he attempted to go down as a kid, he ends up as an adult this kind of washed up, burnt out loser. Somebody who ends up, as he says in the show, apologizing his ways through life. And who ends up being, a stocking employee, an employee at a video rental shop where his boss is younger than he is, and treats him like shit. And the reason that the story gives him a reason to need to do what he's doing, to need to be an important member of Toman, to need to be close to Mikey and close to Draken and close at some point to Baji and like a bunch of other key characters. But what the show is also doing is it's taking an adult, like somebody who has somewhat adult, he's not like 45 or something. He's in his 20s, but somebody who has a reasonably more developed perspective of relationships and of, the world, and putting them back with a bunch of young kids who could use it. This is a great, side thing that constantly happens in Great Teacher Onizuka, and that is whenever any, young delinquents encounter Onizuka, they're almost immediately, waylaid and understand him to be, the real deal. In a way that they can't be, because they're still too young and the world has become too cloistered compared to when he was a crazy Bosozoku member in the 80s to even compete with. The kinds of madness that Ikichi Onizuka faced is something that the delinquents of his time when he's a teacher in Great Teacher Onizuka like yearn for. It's the thing that got them to want to be that in the a delinquent in the first place. And they kind of like immediately recognize him as like the king shit there, and like he's not Onizuka's not mature enough to do a whole lot with that, but what he does do is that it's like say like, hey, like and he does it with like a blunt force hammer effect. He helps fix these kids' lives. He helps them on some level avoid the pitfalls he had because he has this advantage of just time. And that's what you see in Takemichi very often. And yes, it's less apparent than it maybe should be because Takemichi did essentially get stunted by his own lack of a lot of decision making and a lot of confidence when he was the age he gets transported back into the body of. But what you see Takemichi do is you see him recognize like, oh yeah, I remember this. We got the crap kicked out of us. What do I need to do to not get the crap kicked out of me? What do I need to do to make this situation just a little bit better than it was, so I can so the wheels can start turning to make this whole scenario better for me. And a great thing that this story does is that it never really lets Takemichi off the hook. It certainly never lets Takemichi off the hook, but what it does is, since it's not a one-way time travel thing, he travels back and forth with a handshake from Naruto, essentially. Well, not essentially, actually. But what it ends up doing is, every time he comes back to the future, something has slightly changed. And something has slightly changed that causes some other major change. And the first time he comes back to the future, Naruto is still alive. In the very first news report where Takemichi realizes like, oh, my ex-girlfriend is dead, now both Naruto and Hinata die in the same incident. So the first time he comes back, Naruto is still alive. And then every time he comes back, something has shifted, and like things have gotten better but worse in a different direction, and it becomes this game of figuring out who he needs to save and when and why. So he ends up having to like deal with all the really complex and really painful and unforeseen issues that are like interpersonal issues. Like the second season that is notoriously not on Crunchyroll because it is on Hulu. Go figure. Because it was the rights were won by Disney Plus that time round. He actually has to go back and deal with a seemingly unrelated character who, like, through the butterfly effect, causes other problems. So Hinata still dies. And what he has to basically do is mediate family law. And he has to, like, deal with the fact that, like, personal relationship between two brothers is so mangled that it causes reverberations into the future. And I talked about Great Teacher Onizuka, but I want to talk about Tenjo Tenge a little here because I think it's important. Tenjo Tenge quietly deals with a lot of the stuff that is being, especially the anime. The manga is much more direct about it, but Tenjo Tenge quietly deals the anime with a lot of the like Barakaman stuff that is being dealt with in this show and in Tokyo Revengers rather. But what it does do is it lets you in on these little moments of, oh, these kids were cursed before they even realized it. These kids, and there's an extended part of the Tenjo Tenge anime where it doesn't focus on the main cast. It focuses on side and supporting characters years ago. And what that part of the show is doing is it's setting up the circumstances that its main cast members are going to walk into. And Tenjo Tenge has a lot of problems. Lots of great stuff has a lot of problems. Mostly that the stuff is too horny for its own good, and it loses the plot sometimes. But what Tenjo Tenge in particular does really well is it shows you the setup in a way that's crystal clear. It showed you that Shin Natsume was an absolute unstoppable monster, but he was still Maya and Aya's brother. And the fact that he died, and was essentially killed by basically everyone around them, poisoning the well forever, but that it had to happen, builds by showing and not telling all of these interpersonal relationships that you then encounter when, especially when they do the bowling alley episodes of that show, and you realize, like, oh, Aya's going crazy the way her older brother did. That's not good. And what Tokyo Revengers is doing in its run is it's trying to do something similar, but do it in real time, and make sure that our main character, the character who is the instrument of the show, is in front of you. It would be as if you took Nagi and shot him back into the middle of the, like, whole backstory of Shin Natsume and of, Masuomi and all the, like, Tenjo Tenge stuff. And if you're interested in Tenjo Tenge, I encourage you to just go find it. I think you can actually watch it for free over on Retro Crush. With commercials, but it's worth at least seeing because it's pretty and it's weird and it has this, like, platonic idealness of anime in a lot of ways, but I digress. So, and I think similar things about other shows, like I have this obsession with what's it called? The ice skating anime. I forget the name of that anime. It won, like, all the anime awards in the first anime awards. But that show I look at and I'm like, oh, hey, this show isn't just about Yuri on Ice is the name of the show. I can't believe I forgot that. But Yuri on Ice is as much about the, like, kind of, like, same-sex romance thing that's happening as it is about living as an Olympic-level athlete. Because so much of, Yurio's life is he knows all these people from around the world. He's been all around the world and all this, blah, 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 blah. But that's very much backgrounded for the love story they want to tell. In shows like Tokyo Revengers, all of that stuff is foregrounded, but just not focused on, because it's really important to the plot. It's really important that you know that, like, you're never going to stop Draken. You're never going to be able to stop Draken from having the life he has. But you can kind of nudge things along so it helps him get to a better place where he can reflect on it and he can understand that, like, I don't need to be quite so rebellious to carve my place. I can do it in a way that's less destructive. And eventually you do see that the show makes sure that Takemichi manages to make sure that Draken lives. You know, Takemichi manages to avert the first big thing that he has to do is he has to stay close to Mikey or Kisuke, who's the first round villain of this show, essentially. And then every time he does something, that butterfly effect's out and it changes things so incredibly drastically that there's a new problem now. And eventually you get far enough down the line where Draken's still alive. He's in prison, but he's still alive, which is great. But, well, not great, but he's still alive. And there's a new problem. Because when you are not in the typical box of the structure of whatever society you're born into, and you feel like you have to make your own thing off to the side, you don't know what you're doing. You will only be able to get hindsight 2020 once you get to the age of, say, a Takemichi Onizuka in GTO. And so much of what GTO is about when it comes to Ikichi, the main character, is he has the hindsight to be like, you're going to really regret not doing this. Or he has the understanding of like, hey, you guys are screwing up your daughter for no other reason than trying to be a couple of cold assholes to each other. That's not what's important here. Because he has the hindsight to know, like, oh, my mom sucked. Like, oh, I wish I had done this. I wish I had done that. I wish I had done better. All this other stuff. And indeed, the reason why he becomes a teacher in the first place is because he understands, like, there are still kids like me going through the Japanese school system. I want to be of some sort of help for them. And what Takemichi is doing in Tokyo Revengers is almost a time-traveling version of that. But he's also doing his best to help characters get to the point where they can have the 2020 vision back on what happened and back on the fact that they were freaking idiots and try and start to course correct. Because so much of the violence of this show, especially the young violence of this show, is really brutal. And a lot of Takemichi's like goals in the show are keep this person from dying. Like keep an eye on very early on. He needs to keep Baji from dying at this big fight that happens. And first he tries to evade the fight entirely. Second, he tries to not have it happen at all. But while he's not quite successful, what he was successful at is the fact that it happens in a way that's less, where it's less traumatic, where it leaves a different kind of mark on the world than it did when it originally happened. And it's this really interesting meditation on what happens to people when they don't have an opportunity to fit in, or when they tried to go down a road, in the case of Takemichi, when they tried to go down a road and their entire life falls apart. In a lot of ways, Tokyo Revengers has the quality of an isekai because Takemichi is being essentially transported to another time and place, and he's has to remake himself. This is probably where I'm going to end it. But one of the things that a show that people really don't like is Jobless Reincarnation, because they are so focused on the fact that the main character, Rudius, is a bad person. But and I've said this before on my old podcast, Lunchbox Radio, but the thing with Rudius that everyone kind of constantly misses is that, much like Takemichi, Rudius was stunted. He didn't get a fair shake in his original life. And what you're seeing is not meant to be a power fantasy. What you're seeing is somebody who has the curse of time, not the advantage of time. But also it comes to be the advantage of time because you don't spend as much time as a character like Rudius or a character like Takemichi does by yourselves, just kind of drifting through life and not have some introspection. And so when you get the opportunity to have a redo, of course you're going to course correct. Of course you're going to try and do something in a different direction because, Takemichi and also Rudius in Jobless Reincarnation, but we're talking about Tokyo Revengers here, so use the example of Takemichi. Takemichi, as I've said earlier, comes to different points in his past before it goes completely off the rails of anything he ever achieved in his past, which is pretty quickly. And he realizes, oh, all I had to do was something big and flashy. All I had to do was something with confidence, and I just didn't have it then. So, but I know that it's all fake, so I can fake it now. And that, 2020 vision of the past gets him pretty far. And it also allows him to be like, hey, this shit ain't worth it. It allows him to come at characters who are teenagers, so they're stuck in the teenagerdom of that age, and be like, this isn't worth it. This is dumb. Why are you being like this? And very often they don't listen to him. But when they do, or when they finally do, it hits them that oh, what the hell? And very often, if they survive to the current timeline, they encounter Takemichi, and they make the story make sure that you encounter those characters in current day, which is 2017 in the case of this show, and they're like, hey, you really helped back then. Thank you so much. Or and eventually Takemichi starts to rise up the ranks in Tomon in the show's present day because he is helping people. He is genuinely important because he's a voice of reason at the very least for these kids who don't feel like they have any other choice. Who wanted to start a biker gang so they could hang out with their friends and feel like they belonged, and it all kind of spiraled. And on that note, that's where I'm going to leave it. If you like the show, be sure to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. And if you have any thoughts about Tokyo Revengers, be sure to leave it in the comments below. And I will see you next time.